In a city divided by injustice, Judge Laura Grant and Officer Michael Davis are forced to confront the deep divisions in their justice system. Laura, a black judge fighting for reform, and Michael, a cop grappling with his own biases, are drawn together by a controversial trial and rising public unrest. As tensions mount, they must decide if they can help heal the rift or let the system's flaws tear them apart. Comment your thoughts on justice and subscribe for more compelling stories. Don't forget to hit the bell to stay updated. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of Judge Laura Grant's bedroom, casting a warm glow across the room. She stood before her mirror, meticulously adjusting the black judicial robe that seemed to carry more weight today than usual. Her fingers smoothed out the fabric, each movement deliberate. At 38, Laura had learned the art of composure, of maintaining a calm exterior, even when the world around her seemed to unravel. But today felt different. Today carried the weight of history. Her gaze fell on a framed photograph on her dresser, her grandmother, Evelyn, standing tall and defiant during a civil rights march in the 1960s. Her heart swelled with pride and sorrow at the same time. Evelyn had fought for so much, and Laura, now a judge presiding over a landmark civil rights case, felt the echoes of that fight reverberating through her own life. Another day, Laura whispered to herself, adjusting the robe's collar. Another chance to do right. She moved through her home, past her husband Paul, who sat at the kitchen table sipping his morning coffee. He looked up from his newspaper and offered her a smile, though his eyes were shadowed with concern. Paul had always been her rock, but he could even see the toll the job was taking on her, especially now, with a case that had the potential to shake the city, and maybe even the country, to its core. "You sure you're ready for this, Laura?" Paul asked, his voice soft but filled with meaning. He knew what this case meant, not just for her career but for their community. The lawsuit against the city's police department was set to reveal systemic racial profiling practices. If handled correctly, it could lead to a sea change. If mishandled, it could deepen already festering divisions. "I have to be ready," she replied, forcing a smile as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "It's too important not to be." Paul stood up and placed a hand on her shoulder, his thumb brushing the edge of her robe. "Just take care of yourself. This isn't just another case. It's personal." Laura nodded, her throat tight. He was right. It was personal. Every case was personal when you were a black woman sitting on the bench in a system that had historically failed people who looked like her. She finished her coffee and gathered her briefcase, her mind already shifting to the courtroom. The facts, the precedents, the legal arguments she had prepared endlessly for this moment. As she stepped out the door, the crisp morning air hit her face, a reminder of the day ahead. The world outside was quiet, but Laura could feel the weight of what was to come. There was a responsibility on her shoulders, a legacy she carried not just for herself, but for her grandmother, her family, and her community. Across town, Officer Michael Davis stood at attention outside the courthouse, his crisp blue uniform in sharp contrast to the weathered stone steps of the building. At 25, Michael was still adjusting to his role on the force. Today was his first assignment at the courthouse, and he was determined to make a good impression. His nerves were high, but his eagerness to prove himself was even higher. "First day on courthouse duty, rookie?" A senior officer, Sergeant Thomas, walked by, a smirk playing at his lips. "Yes, sir," Michael replied, standing a little straighter. "Ready to serve and protect." The sergeant chuckled. "Just keep your head on straight. You'll be fine." Michael nodded, his eyes already scanning the growing crowd. People were arriving for the day's hearings, and he felt the familiar tension in his muscles. His hand brushed against the holster at his side, a subconscious reassurance that he was prepared for anything. He didn't consider himself biased. After all, he was a good cop. But as a group of young black men walked up the courthouse steps, Michael's body tensed. He couldn't help it. They were laughing and talking loudly, and his instincts kicked in. His hand moved closer to his gun as his eyes followed their every movement. "Keep it together, Davis," he muttered under his breath. He was here to protect everyone after all, but he couldn't deny the unease that crept into his mind when certain people walked by. As the morning wore on, Michael became more rigid, more alert. His gaze lingered on people of color longer than it did on others. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself, but his training hadn't prepared him for this, the subtle biases that shaped how he viewed the world around him. To him, he was just doing his job, keeping the courthouse safe. Judge Grant's car rolled to a stop in front of the courthouse, her mind already focused on the day's proceedings. She was dressed casually for now, her judicial robe folded neatly over her arm. She planned to change in her chambers before the case began. As she climbed the steps, her thoughts were on the legal battle ahead. She didn't notice Officer Davis watching her with suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," Michael called out, stepping in front of her. His posture was stiff, authoritative. "Where do you think you're going?" Laura blinked, surprised by the sudden confrontation. "I'm heading into the courthouse," she said calmly, gesturing toward the doors. Michael narrowed his eyes. Something about her didn't sit right with him. She didn't look like a judge, not in that attire. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Laura frowned. "I don't have my ID on me," she replied, her voice firm but polite. "I'm Judge Laura Grant. I have a case today." Michael's jaw tightened. He'd heard it all before. "A likely story," he scoffed. "You expect me to believe you're a judge?" Laura took a deep breath, struggling to maintain her composure. "Officer, if you'll just let me explain—" "No," Michael interrupted, his voice rising. "You're trespassing on government property. You need to leave." By now, a small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation unfold. Laura could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers in the air. This was not how her morning was supposed to go. She clutched her robe a little tighter, her mind racing. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," she tried again, but Michael wasn't listening. His hand was hovering dangerously close to his gun, and his face was twisted in frustration. "You're not getting in without ID," he snapped. "I'm calling for backup." The humiliation stung. Laura stood her ground, but inside, anger and hurt bubbled up. She was a judge, a black woman in a position of authority, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. She felt the weight of her ancestors on her shoulders, the legacy of every black person who had ever been stopped, questioned, and treated as less than. Finally, Laura reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. Slowly, she flipped it open, revealing her judicial badge. "Officer Davis," she said, her voice steady but hard. "I believe this is what you've been asking for." Michael stared at the badge, the color draining from his face as he realized the gravity of his mistake. The crowd murmured, the tension palpable. He stammered an apology, but the damage was done. Laura looked at him, not with anger, but with disappointment. "Officer Davis," she said quietly, "you still have much to learn about justice." The rest of the day passed in a blur for both Laura and Michael, though for entirely different reasons. Laura's case had begun, the courtroom proceedings drawing media attention and public scrutiny. But her mind kept drifting back to the steps of the courthouse, to the look on Officer Davis's face when he realized who she was. The humiliation of it all weighed on her, yet she couldn't afford to let it distract her from the task at hand. For Michael, the incident gnawed at him. His hands shook as he wrote his report, each word a reminder of his failure. He had misjudged her, completely and utterly, and now the whole department knew. Worse, the city would likely hear about it soon enough. He had been so sure of himself, so sure that he was on the right. But now, doubt crept in, and with it, shame. Later that evening, alone in his small apartment, Michael sat in silence, replaying the confrontation over and over in his mind. He saw himself through new eyes, and the reflection wasn't pretty. He wasn't the hero he had imagined. He was part of the problem. Judge Laura Grant sat in her chambers, the heavy wooden door separating her from the courtroom. Her mind wasn't on the case just yet, though it should have been. Instead, she found herself replaying the morning's confrontation over and over. How quickly Officer Davis had assumed she didn't belong, how easily his hand had hovered over his gun. She had faced microaggressions her entire life, but this was different. This was blatant, public, and personal. The worst part wasn't the embarrassment. It was the reminder of how ingrained racial biases still were, even among those tasked with upholding the law. Laura's hands trembled slightly as she lifted a cup of tea to her lips. She hadn't let it show earlier, but the encounter had shaken her. She had thought her position, a judge, would protect her from such things, but here she was, a black woman first, a judge second, in the eyes of people like Officer Davis. There was a knock at the door. Her husband Paul stepped inside, his expression heavy with concern. "I heard what happened," he said softly, walking toward her. "The courthouse is buzzing." Laura sighed, setting her cup down on the desk. "I thought I was past this," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I thought I had moved beyond being seen as just another black woman. But it doesn't matter what titles I hold, does it? People still see me as a threat." Paul knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "You're more than a title, Laura. You're a symbol of what this country can be. That's why it hurts so much." "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Paul," Laura whispered. "It's exhausting. Fighting for respect in every room I walk into, even ones I've earned the right to be in." Paul squeezed her hands. "You're doing more than just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every little black girl who will come after you, who needs to see someone like you on that bench." Laura swallowed the lump in her throat. He was right, of course. He always was. But it didn't make the burden any lighter. Across town, Officer Michael Davis sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. His uniform lay in a heap on the chair across the room, a silent reminder of the day's humiliation. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. His partner, Nick, had texted him, asking if he wanted to grab a beer after work. He ignored it. The silence in his apartment was deafening, filled with the weight of his thoughts. He had messed up, badly. But the worst part wasn't just that he had wrongfully stopped a judge. It was that deep down, he knew why he had done it. He had made a snap judgment because of the color of her skin. It was something he had never consciously acknowledged about himself before. He had always thought of himself as one of the good guys, but now the incident with Judge Grant had peeled back layers of denial he didn't even know existed. He had acted on instinct, and that instinct was tainted by biases he wasn't ready to face. The next morning, Michael walked into the precinct with his head low. Whispers followed him down the hall, and every glance felt like judgment. Sergeant Thomas approached him with a clipboard in hand, his face neutral, but Michael could feel the disappointment radiating off him. "Davis, you're off courthouse duty for the time being," Thomas said, handing over a reassignment form. "You'll be working patrol until this situation dies down." Michael nodded stiffly, feeling the weight of the paperwork like a lead brick. "I understand." "And one more thing," Thomas added, his voice lowering. "Chief Walker wants to see you. Now." Michael knocked on Chief Daniel Walker's office door, his heart hammering in his chest. He had never been called to the chief's office before. Not for anything good, anyway. When he entered, Chief Walker looked up from his desk, his gray eyes scanning Michael for a moment before gesturing for him to sit down. Chief Walker leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You know why you're here, right?" "Yes, sir," Michael replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The incident with Judge Grant." Walker paused, watching Michael's face. "It's not going away, Davis. We've had complaints. The media's caught wind of it. People are talking." Michael swallowed hard. He had expected this, but it still stung to hear it out loud. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Walker continued. "You screwed up. You made a judgment based on nothing but skin color, and that's not acceptable. Not in this department, not anywhere." Michael's face burned with shame. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter what you meant," Walker interrupted sharply. "What matters is what you did." There was a long silence, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. "But I'm not going to fire you," Walker said, his voice softening slightly. "At least not yet. I believe in second chances, Davis, but only if you're willing to put in the work." Michael looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Walker slid a pamphlet across the desk. "We're offering anti-bias training. You'll attend every session, and I'll be watching your progress closely. You can consider this your one and only chance to make things right." Michael stared at the pamphlet, the words "Implicit Bias Training Program" printed in bold letters across the top. His gut reaction was resistance. He didn't need this. He wasn't a racist. But the memory of Judge Grant's disappointed eyes flashed through his mind, and his resistance crumbled. "Do you understand what I'm saying, Davis?" Walker asked, his voice firm. "Yes, sir," Michael replied quietly. "I understand." A week later, Michael found himself sitting in a sterile conference room at the police station, surrounded by a dozen other officers. The atmosphere was tense, and the room buzzed with uncomfortable murmurs. None of them wanted to be here. Most, like Michael, had been ordered to attend. Others had signed up reluctantly, pressured by growing concerns about the department's public image. Michael shifted in his seat, the pamphlet crumpled in his hand. His gaze drifted toward the front of the room where the instructor stood, reviewing her notes. He had expected some kind of HR professional, but when Judge Laura Grant walked in, his heart stopped. She was the last person he had expected to see. His throat tightened as he realized this wasn't just any training. This was personal. The room fell silent as Laura approached the podium, her posture tall and graceful. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering for just a moment on Michael. He could feel her gaze, though she gave no indication that she recognized him. "Good morning," Laura began, her voice calm and composed. "I'm Judge Laura Grant, and I'll be leading today's session on implicit bias." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He had thought he was ready for this, but now, with Judge Grant standing in front of him, every ounce of his confidence drained away. Laura's voice was steady as she spoke. "We all have biases, whether we're conscious of them or not. These biases shape the way we interact with the world, the way we see people, and the decisions we make, both in our personal lives and in our professional roles." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the words hitting far too close to home. He tried to keep his head down, but he couldn't help glancing up at her. She spoke with such conviction, such grace, even after what he had done. How could she stand here, so composed, after being humiliated in front of her own courthouse? "Today isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," Laura continued. "It's about recognizing the biases we all carry and learning how to address them, how to overcome them." Michael felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He had a lot to learn. As the session continued, Michael found himself more and more uncomfortable. The exercises forced him to confront things he didn't want to admit, that he had made snap judgments about people based on nothing more than their race, their clothes, their demeanor. It was an ugly truth, one that left him feeling raw and exposed. During a group exercise, he was paired with another officer, Officer Rebecca Carter, a black woman who had been on the force for nearly a decade. She didn't say much at first, but when the conversation turned to personal experiences, she shared stories of being profiled by her own colleagues, of feeling like she constantly had to prove herself. Michael listened in silence, guilt gnawing at him. He realized that he had never really considered what it was like for officers like Carter or for people like Judge Grant. He had been so wrapped up in his own perspective, in his own assumptions. "I didn't realize," Michael said quietly, more to himself than to Carter. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of understanding and weariness. "A lot of people don't." By the end of the session, Michael felt emotionally drained, but for the first time he also felt something else, a glimmer of hope. He had been wrong. He knew that now, but he also knew that he had the power to change, to be better. As the officers filed out of the room, Michael lingered behind, watching as Judge Grant gathered her notes at the podium. He hesitated for a moment before walking up to her. "Judge Grant," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up, her eyes meeting him. There was no anger in her expression, no resentment, only a quiet understanding. I just wanted to apologize," Michael continued, his words stumbling out. "For what happened at the courthouse. I was wrong. I made assumptions and I'm sorry." Laura studied him for a long moment, her gaze steady. Then she nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, Officer Davis. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him, though the shame still lingered. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to learning." Laura nodded again, her expression softening. "That's all anyone can ask for." The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Judge Laura Grant's courtroom, casting long shadows across the floor. The room was buzzing with the quiet murmurs of anticipation as people filed into their seats. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and onlookers. The landmark civil rights case had drawn attention from all corners of the city, and tensions were high. Laura sat at her bench, her gavel resting in front of her, as she reviewed the case notes for the lawsuit. The plaintiff, Olivia Williams, was a young black woman who had been wrongfully arrested by the city's police force, accused of shoplifting based solely on a hasty assumption by store security and the responding officers. Her case had become a flashpoint in the ongoing debate over racial profiling in the city. But as much as Laura tried to focus on the facts of the case, her thoughts kept drifting back to the encounter with Officer Davis. She had seen something shift in him during the training session, an understanding, a willingness to change. But was it enough? Could a single moment of clarity erase years of ingrained bias? She sighed and looked out at the people seated in the gallery. Olivia's family, community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens. They were all watching, waiting, hoping for justice. And then there were the police officers seated near the back, including Officer Davis. He had been assigned to sit in the courtroom for the duration of the trial, a part of his duty to ensure security. But Laura knew it was more than that. Chief Walker had placed him there intentionally, perhaps as a reminder of what was at stake. Laura's heart felt heavy. This trial was not just about Olivia, it was about the systemic biases that plagued the entire city. And as a black woman sitting on the bench, Laura knew all too well what those biases looked like. Olivia Williams stood nervously at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. She was young, no more than 20, and her eyes darted around the courtroom as if looking for a way to escape. But when her attorney called her to the stand, she took a deep breath and walked forward with as much confidence as she could muster. Laura watched as Olivia was sworn in, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was Olivia's chance to tell her story, to speak the truth about what had happened to her. "Can you tell the court what happened on the day you were arrested?" the attorney asked. Olivia swallowed hard before speaking. "I went to the store to buy a birthday gift for my little sister. I was looking at some necklaces when I noticed the security guard watching me. At first I thought it was just normal, you know? But then it got worse. He started following me like I was doing something wrong." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "I felt so uncomfortable that I decided to leave. I didn't want to be in the store anymore. As soon as I walked out, the security guard grabbed me. He said I was stealing, but I hadn't taken anything." Olivia's voice cracked as she recounted the rest of the story, the way the police had arrived, the way they had treated her as if she were already guilty, how she had been handcuffed, searched, and taken to the station without any evidence. "I kept telling them I didn't steal anything," Olivia said, her eyes filling with tears. "But they didn't listen. They didn't believe me." The courtroom was silent as Olivia finished her testimony. Laura could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken understanding that this was not an isolated incident. Olivia's story was one that echoed through the lives of countless others, including Laura herself. She had been there in those shoes, judged unfairly because of the color of her skin. Laura's gaze shifted to Officer Davis. He sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable, but she could see the turmoil behind his eyes. He was grappling with the same questions she had asked herself. How many times had he made a similar assumption? How many people had he wrongfully judged? Officer Michael Davis sat rigidly in his seat, his gaze fixed on Olivia Williams as she left the stand. He had heard stories like hers before, but they had always been distant, abstract. Now, hearing it firsthand, it felt different, more personal, more real. The shame he had felt during the bias training session came flooding back. He remembered how he had treated Judge Grant, how easily he had dismissed her, how quickly he had assumed she didn't belong. And now, as he sat in her courtroom, listening to Olivia's story, the parallels were undeniable. Michael's thoughts churned. His instincts, his training, had all led him to believe he was a protector, a guardian of the law. But now he wasn't so sure. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, but what if he had been wrong? What if he had been part of the problem all along? The case continued, with the defense trying to paint Olivia as an unreliable witness, claiming that the security footage, though grainy and unclear, showed enough to justify her arrest. But Michael saw through it. It was the same justification he had used on the courthouse steps, that instinctual feeling of suspicion based on nothing but preconceived notions. As the day wore on, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this trial was about more than just Olivia's case. It was about him, about every officer in the city, about the entire justice system. And it wasn't just a question of whether or not Olivia had stolen anything. It was about the way people like her were seen, judged, and treated. Chief Daniel Walker watched the trial from a distance, his eyes narrowing as the defense made their arguments. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the flaws in the system, but the city's police department was like a machine with too many moving parts. Even as its leader, he struggled to make the changes he knew were necessary. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text message from Officer Davis. It was brief but significant. "I need to talk after the trial." Walker raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Davis had been one of the most promising recruits, but his encounter with Judge Grant had shaken something loose in him. Walker had hoped anti-bias training would help, but now it seemed like something deeper was going on. He pocketed his phone and turned his attention back to the trial. As much as he wanted to see real reform in his department, he knew it wasn't something that could be forced from the top down. Change had to come from within, from officers like Davis, who were willing to confront their own biases. The trial had stretched over 2 long weeks, and now the fate of Olivia Williams' case was in the hands of the jury. The courtroom was filled with a charged silence as everyone waited for the verdict. The tension was almost unbearable, especially for Laura. She sat on her bench, her face composed, but inside her heart pounded. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Olivia's family sat in the front row, holding hands, their faces drawn with anxiety. Behind them, community leaders and activists watched with bated breath, knowing that the outcome of this case could have far-reaching consequences. And then there were police officers sitting together in a cluster, their expressions unreadable. As the jury re-entered the courtroom, Laura straightened in her chair. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that contained the jury's decision. Every eye in the room was trained on that single piece of paper, as if it held the power to determine not just Olivia's fate, but the fate of the entire city. We, the jury, find the defendant. The foreperson's voice wavered for a moment. Not guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Olivia's family embraced her, tears of relief streaming down their faces. But the victory felt hollow. Laura could see it in the eyes of everyone in the room. Olivia had been found not guilty, but the deeper issues, the systemic biases, the assumptions that had led to her arrest, remained unresolved. Laura's heart sank. Justice had been served in the narrowest sense, but true justice, the kind that addressed the root of the problem, still felt out of reach. Later that evening, Officer Davis sat across from Chief Walker in his office. The dim light from the overhead lamp cast shadows across the room, adding to the somber mood. "I can't do this anymore," Davis said quietly, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. Walker raised an eyebrow. "Can't do what?" "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine. I've been wrong about so many things, about how I see people, about how I do my job." Davis's voice cracked as he spoke. "This case, Olivia's case, it made me realize how blind I've been." Walker leaned back in his chair, watching Davis carefully. "What exactly are you saying?" "I want to change," Davis replied, his voice firm. "I need to change. I don't want to be the kind of cop who makes snap judgments, who sees a person of color and immediately assumes they're guilty, but I don't know how." The room was silent for a long moment. Walker studied the young officer in front of him, seeing the genuine pain and confusion in his eyes. "You're already on the right path," Walker said finally. "The fact that you're willing to admit you need to change, that's the first step. But it's not enough just to recognize your biases. You have to be willing to do the work to overcome them." Davis nodded, his throat tight. "I want to. I really do." Walker leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Then you need to start by listening. To people like Olivia. To people like Judge Grant. You need to listen to their experiences, to their pain, and you need to let that guide how you do your job from now on." Davis swallowed hard, the weight of Walker's words sinking in. "I'll do whatever it takes." As the city settled into the quiet of night, Laura sat in her home office, her eyes drifting over the stacks of legal documents on her desk. The trial was over, but the weight of the day still hung heavily on her. She thought of Olivia, of the relief and disappointment that had warred in her eyes as the verdict was read. She thought of Officer Davis, of the guilt and shame she had seen in his face during the training session. He had apologized, yes, but apologies didn't change the system. Apologies didn't fix what was broken. Laura closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. She had spent her life fighting for justice, real justice. But tonight she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Her phone buzzed on the desk and she glanced down to see a text from Paul. "Dinner's ready when you are. Don't work too late." Laura smiled softly to herself. Paul always knew when to pull her out of her head. She stood up, leaving the documents behind, and made her way downstairs. The fight for justice will continue tomorrow. For tonight, she needed to rest. The city was buzzing with anger and frustration. The not guilty verdict in Olivia Williams' case had triggered waves of protests, and the streets were alive with chants and signs calling for justice. It was as though the verdict had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the justice system. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their faces a mixture of determination and exhaustion. They were tired of fighting, but they knew they couldn't stop now. Judge Laura Grant stood in her office, watching the scene from the window. The peaceful protest outside was a reminder that, even though the verdict had been delivered, the fight for justice was far from over. Her heart ached with the weight of it all. She had done her job, followed the law, but the law hadn't brought true justice. She thought of Olivia, whose life had been turned upside down by one wrongful arrest. Though she had been found not guilty, the experience would linger, shaping how she moved through the world. Laura knew this because she had lived it. And now, the people outside were calling for something greater than a single verdict. They were calling for systemic change. The door to her office opened and Paul stepped in. "It's getting intense out there," he said, nodding toward the window. "I know," Laura replied softly. "They want real change. I can't blame them." Paul walked over, standing beside her. "Do you think they'll listen this time?" Laura sighed. "I don't know. I hope so." Officer Michael Davis stood near the courthouse steps, watching the growing crowd with a mixture of apprehension and guilt. He was there for crowd control, part of a team sent to maintain peace during the protests. But as he looked at the faces of the people holding signs that said, "Justice for Olivia" and "End racial profiling," he realized that he wasn't there just to keep the peace. He was there to face himself. The protests had started peacefully, but the tension in the air was thick. Michael could feel it vibrating through the streets. People were angry, and rightfully so. He thought of Olivia's testimony, of how easily her life had been turned upside down by a security guard's snap judgment. How many times had he done the same thing, assuming guilt because of someone's appearance? A group of young men passed by him, their expressions hard, their voices loud with chants. For a moment, Michael's muscles tensed, his body instinctively going into alert mode. But then he caught himself. He forced himself to relax, to let go of the old habits that had been ingrained in him. These weren't threats, they were citizens demanding their voices be heard. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from down the street. Michael turned just in time to see a garbage can tipped over, its contents spilling into the street. A group of teenagers ran past, laughing as they disappeared into an alley. The crowd shifted, their energy becoming restless, nervous. Michael's heart pounded. This was the moment he had dreaded, when a peaceful protest teetered on the edge of chaos. Michael moved through the crowd, his hand hovering near his radio as he tried to assess the situation. A line of riot police had formed at the edge of the crowd, their shields up, ready to step in if things escalated. The protesters, sensing the tension, began to chant louder, their frustration mounting as they faced the wall of officers. "Stand down," Michael muttered under his breath, wishing he could say it aloud. The last thing they needed was for the situation to explode. He could feel the anger from both sides, the protesters, who had been ignored for too long, and the police, who were prepared for confrontation. A young man in a black hoodie stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Why are you even here?" he shouted at the officers. What are you protecting? This system is broken, and you're just holding it up." Michael recognized the pain in the young man's voice. It was the same pain he had seen in Olivia's eyes, the same pain he had felt when he realized the role he had played in this broken system. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, trying to put himself between the crowd and the line of riot police. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. This was the moment where everything could go wrong or right. "Hey!" Michael called out to the young man. "What's your name?" The young man glared at him, his fist clenched. "Why do you care?" "Because I do," Michael said, his voice steady. "I'm here to listen, not to fight. What's your name?" There was a moment of hesitation. Then the young man answered, "Marcus." Michael nodded. "All right, Marcus, I get it. I know you're angry. I know you've been ignored, and that's not right. But we don't have to let this turn into something worse. Let's talk. Tell me what you need." Marcus blinked, surprised by Michael's approach. The crowd quieted slightly, watching the interaction with curiosity. Michael felt the weight of their stares, but he didn't let it shake him. He kept his focus on Marcus, waiting for him to speak. After a long pause, Marcus spoke again. "We need justice. We need to stop being treated like criminals just because of the way we look." Michael nodded slowly. "I hear you, and you're right. We do need to change, but we can't fix it if this turns into a fight. Let's keep it peaceful, and I promise I'll listen. I'll take your concerns back to the department. We'll make sure your voices are heard." The tension in Marcus's body seemed to ease, just a little. He looked at Michael, searching for signs of insincerity, but found none. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice softer, "but this isn't over." "It's not," Michael agreed. "It's just the beginning." The crowd seemed to relax as Marcus and Michael continued to talk. The riot police, sensing the shift in energy, lowered their shields slightly. Michael's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't about him. It was about finding a way forward, about showing the community that not all officers were there to oppress them. A few other protesters joined the conversation, expressing their anger and frustration. Michael listened carefully, taking mental notes of everything they said. He knew that he couldn't fix everything in one day, but he could start by being someone who listened, really listened. As the conversation continued, more officers stepped forward, not in aggression but in support. Michael glanced over his shoulder and saw Officer Rebecca Carter, the woman he had partnered with during bias training, nodding at him. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. Slowly, the protest began to settle. People dispersed, some returning to their homes, others remaining to continue peaceful discussions with the officers who had stayed behind. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had managed to defuse the situation without violence, without arrests, without escalating the conflict. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something right. Judge Laura Grant stood at her office window, watching the crowd begin to disperse. The tension in the air had lessened and the chants had softened. She hadn't seen exactly what had happened, but she knew something had changed. Her phone buzzed on her desk, and she picked it up to see a text from one of her colleagues. "The protests are calming down. Officer Davis took the lead. Handled it well." Laura blinked in surprise. Officer Davis? The same man who had confronted her on the courthouse steps. The same man who had struggled with his own biases. He had managed to calm the storm. She smiled softly, her heart swelling with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe people could change. Maybe there was still hope for the system after all. She glanced at the stack of legal documents on her desk, her mind shifting back to the bigger picture. The fight for justice was far from over. There were still so many cases like Olivia's, So many people who had been wrongfully targeted by a system built on flawed assumptions. But perhaps if people like Michael Davis could change, there was a chance that the system could change too. Laura made a silent vow to herself. She would continue to push for that change, both in and out of the courtroom. She would be the voice for those who had been silenced, the light for those who had been left in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, she would live to see the day when true justice was served. Michael stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching the last of the protesters walk away. His body felt heavy, but in a different way than before. This time, it wasn't the weight of guilt or shame, it was the weight of responsibility. He had managed to avoid a disaster, but he knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. There was so much more work to be done, both within the department and within himself. He had taken the first step, but the road ahead was long and full of challenges. Rebecca Carter walked up beside him, her expression thoughtful. "You did good today," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Michael nodded, still processing everything. "Thanks, but I've got a long way to go." "We all do," Rebecca replied. "But the fact that you're willing to walk that road, that's what matters." Michael looked out at the city, the fading sunlight casting a golden hue over the skyline. "I just want to do better," he said, almost to himself. Rebecca smiled. "Then keep doing what you did today. Keep listening." As they stood together on the courthouse steps, Michael realized that this was his new purpose, not just to serve and protect, but to listen, to learn, and to change. It wasn't going to be easy. He would make mistakes, and there would be setbacks. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. A week later, the city was still buzzing with conversations about the protests, the trial, and the role of the police in the community. Michael's actions had made waves, and people were starting to take notice. The media had picked up on his efforts to de-escalate the situation, and several community leaders had reached out to commend him for his approach. But Michael wasn't interested in praise. He knew that one good day didn't erase the mistakes of the past. It didn't fix the system, but it was a start. At the precinct, Chief Walker called him into his office for a private conversation. Michael entered, feeling a mix of nerves and curiosity. "Sit down, Davis," Walker said, his tone unreadable. Michael sat, his heart pounding. "Sir?" Walker studied him for a moment before speaking. "I heard about what you did at the protests. I have to admit, I didn't expect you to handle it the way you did." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what I thought was right." Walker nodded. "And that's exactly why I called you in here. You did do the right thing, and I want you to keep doing it." Michael's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I want you to be part of our community outreach team," Walker said, leaning forward. "You've shown that you can listen, that you can connect with people. We need officers like you out there building trust with the community." Michael blinked, surprised by the offer. He had never thought of himself as someone who could do that kind of work. But as he thought about it, he realized that it was exactly what he wanted to do. "I'd be honored, sir," Michael said, his voice steady. Walker smiled. "Good, because we need more officers like you." It had been 2 weeks since the protests outside the courthouse, and the atmosphere in the city was still charged, though the intensity had begun to fade. For Officer Michael Davis, things had changed dramatically. He had officially been reassigned to the Community Outreach Division, a role he never expected to have. This wasn't the path he had envisioned when he first joined the force, but now he realized it was exactly what he needed. Michael stood outside a community center in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. The building was worn down, its paint peeling, but it was a hub of activity. Children ran in and out, and groups of teenagers gathered outside, talking and laughing. It felt worlds away from the courthouse steps, where tensions had almost exploded just days ago. His heart beat faster as he approached the doors, unsure of how he would be received. His job now was to build trust between the police and the community, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Many of the people here had grown up with a deep mistrust of law enforcement, and he couldn't blame them for it. He had been part of the problem, whether he had intended to be or not. As he walked inside, he was greeted by the center's coordinator, Miss Cheryl Adams, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had spent her life working to better her community. "Officer Davis?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's me," Michael replied with a small smile, extending his hand. "Thanks for letting me come by today." Cheryl looked him up and down before shaking his hand. Her grip was firm. "I heard about what happened at the protests. You handled yourself well." Michael nodded, unsure of what to say. I just wanted to listen." "That's a good start," Cheryl said, her voice neutral. "But listening is only the first step. Trust takes time. It takes consistency. These people have been hurt too many times to believe in words alone." "I understand," Michael said softly, feeling the weight of her words. He knew he couldn't undo the damage overnight. "Come on then," Cheryl said, nodding toward the main hall. "There's a youth group meeting in a few minutes. They're not big fans of the police, but I think it's important they meet you." Michael followed her, his nerves buzzing. He wasn't sure how the teens would react to his presence, but he knew he had to try. Building trust was going to take time, and he was committed to seeing it through. The community center's main hall was packed with teenagers, their voices filling the room as they talked in groups. Most of them glanced at Michael as he walked in, their expressions guarded. He could feel the mistrust in the air. It was palpable, like a wall between him and the kids in front of him. Cheryl led Michael to the front of the room, where she cleared her throat to get everyone's attention. The chatter died down, and all eyes turned to them. "All right, listen up," Cheryl said, her voice firm but kind. "This is Officer Michael Davis. He's here to talk to you today, but more importantly, he's here to listen." Michael took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hey, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the tension. "I know you probably don't want to hear from another cop right now, and I get that. I'm not here to tell you what to do or to give you a speech. I'm here because I need to learn and I need to listen. Things have been broken for a long time, and I want to help fix them." A teenager sitting near the front, a boy with a baseball cap turned backward, snorted. "Yeah, right. Cops always say they want to help, but they're the ones messing things up in the first place." Michael nodded. "You're right," he said, surprising the boy. "We've messed up. I've messed up. I'm not here to pretend I haven't made mistakes, because I have, but I'm trying to change that." The boy narrowed his eyes. "Why should we believe you?" Michael met his gaze, unflinching. "You don't have to. Not yet. Trust isn't built with words, it's built with actions. I can't ask you to trust me, but I can show you that I'm serious about change." There was a pause, and then the boy nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. It wasn't much, but it was something. Michael knew this wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't going to win over the community with a single conversation, but he was determined to keep showing up, to keep listening. As the meeting went on, more teens began to speak up, sharing their experiences with the police, their frustrations and their fears. Michael listened to every word, feeling the weight of their stories settled into his chest. This was what he had needed to hear all along, the real, raw truth from the people who had been on the other side of his badge. When the meeting finally ended, Michael stood by the door as the teens filed out. A few of them offered nods or brief smiles, but most kept their distance. That was fine. He knew trust wasn't going to come easily, but he had shown up, and he would keep showing up no matter how long it took. While Michael worked to rebuild trust in the community, Judge Laura Grant found herself grappling with the aftermath of the Olivia Williams trial. Though Olivia had been found not guilty, the system that had targeted her remained unchanged. Laura had hoped the case would spark real reform, but the city's leadership seemed more concerned with avoiding controversy than addressing the root of the problem. Laura sat in a meeting with several city officials, including Mayor Sarah Nichols, a polished woman in her early 40s who had built her career on navigating the city's political minefields. The room was filled with the usual political posturing, as the mayor and her advisors discussed how to handle the public's outcry without making any real changes. "We need to maintain order and reassure the public that the police are doing their jobs," Mayor Nichols said, her tone crisp. "But we can't go too far. We don't want to alienate our law enforcement." Laura's patience was wearing thin. "With all due respect, Mayor Nichols, maintaining order isn't enough. The system is broken. People like Olivia Williams are being profiled and arrested without cause, and that's what we need to address." Mayor Nichols gave her a tight smile. "I understand your concerns, Judge Grant, but these things take time. We can't overhaul the system overnight." "Time is running out," Laura said, her voice firm. "The people out there aren't asking for a complete overhaul. They're asking for accountability. They're asking for police officers to treat them with the same respect they give to others. That's not too much to ask." The room went silent for a moment, and Laura could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. She knew she was pushing them, but she couldn't sit quietly while they talked around the real issue. Mayor Nichols cleared her throat, her smile faltering slightly. "I hear you, Judge Grant. We'll take your concerns under advisement." Laura stood up, her heart pounding with frustration. "Advisement isn't enough. Action is what we need." Without waiting for a response, Laura turned and left the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was tired of waiting for change. It was time to fight for it. The sun was setting as Michael walked through the neighborhood he had once patrolled with suspicion. Now, as part of the community outreach team, he saw the streets through a different lens. He didn't look for threats. He looked for opportunities to connect. His mind kept drifting back to the teenagers at the community center, to the stories they had shared. They were right to mistrust him. He had been part of a system that had failed them. But now, he wanted to be part of the solution. As he walked, he spotted a familiar face, Marcus, the young man he had spoken to during the protests. Marcus was sitting on the steps of a corner store, talking with a group of friends. Michael hesitated for a moment, then approached slowly, his hands at his sides, non-threatening. Marcus looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Officer Davis," he said, his voice cautious. "Hey, Marcus," Michael replied with a nod. "Mind if I sit?" Marcus shrugged, but his body language relaxed slightly. "Sure." Michael sat down on the steps beside him, his gaze focused on the street ahead. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day, about needing justice." Marcus didn't respond at first, but after a moment he said, And I think you're right," Michael said, his voice steady. "You deserve better. The whole community does. I'm trying to figure out how I can help fix things, but I know it's going to take time." Marcus glanced at him, his expression softening just a bit. "At least you're trying." Michael smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I'm going to keep trying, and I'll keep listening too." The two of them sat in silence for a few minutes, the city's evening noises filling the space between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Marcus didn't trust him yet, but Michael was willing to put in the work to change that. Laura sat in her chambers late into the evening, her desk covered in papers. She had been working tirelessly since the Olivia Williams trial, reviewing similar cases, trying to find patterns, trying to gather evidence that could force the city to make real changes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Paul. "Dinner's ready. Don't stay too late again." Laura smiled softly. Paul had been her rock through all of this, but she knew he was worried about her. She had been pushing herself harder than ever, but she couldn't stop. There was too much at stake. She glanced at the stack of case files on her desk. Each one represented a person whose life had been disrupted or destroyed by a system that saw them as less than. Laura knew she couldn't fix everything, but she could keep fighting. And maybe, just maybe, she could help build a system that treated people like Olivia Williams with the dignity and respect they deserved. With a sigh, she stood up and gathered her things. It was time to go home and recharge. Tomorrow would be another battle, but she was ready for it. The next day, Laura and Michael found themselves at a community forum organized by Chief Walker. The event was designed to foster dialogue between the police and the community, to rebuild trust and find common ground. As Laura walked into the auditorium, she spotted Michael standing near the front talking with a group of teenagers. He looked different from the man who had confronted her on the courthouse steps, more grounded, more open. Michael saw her and offered a small nod. Laura returned the gesture, feeling a sense of mutual understanding pass between them. They had both changed since that day. They had both learned, grown, and found new ways to fight for justice. As the forum began, the two of them took their places, Laura at the front speaking as a judge who understood the community's pain, and Michael among the people, listening to their stories, offering his support. They were on different paths, but their goal was the same: justice, equality, change. The weeks following the community forum brought a wave of both hope and uncertainty. The city was watching closely as Judge Laura Grant and Officer Michael Davis continued their respective paths toward change. Laura was pushing for reform within the judicial system, reviewing cases that had been marred by racial profiling, while Michael was working with the community outreach team to rebuild trust, one conversation at a time. But beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. The media had latched onto the Olivia Williams case, and it became a symbol of a larger problem that the city couldn't ignore any longer. The mayor's office and police department were under pressure to implement reforms, but there was resistance from within. Many officers, especially those who had been on the force for decades, felt threatened by the changes being proposed. Chief Daniel Walker was walking a tightrope, trying to balance the demands of the community with the internal resistance of the department. He had been supportive of Michael's efforts in the community, but he knew that not everyone in the force was on board with the changes. The pressure was building, and Laura could feel it. Every day, the courthouse steps were filled with protesters demanding action. The city was holding its breath, waiting for the next flashpoint. The courtroom was silent as Laura reviewed the details of her latest case. Samuel Dawson, a 19-year-old black man, had been charged with armed robbery. The evidence was thin, but the arrest had been swift, based largely on an eyewitness account that was later revealed to be unreliable. Laura had seen this story play out before. A young man arrested and charged without sufficient evidence, based on little more than assumptions. The case had drawn significant attention, and Laura knew that the public was watching closely. Samuel's family had been vocal in the media, insisting on his innocence, while community leaders pointed to his arrest as yet another example of racial profiling in action. Laura felt the weight of the situation. This case could set a precedent, just like Olivia Williams' case had. If she ruled in Samuel's favor, it would be a victory for those fighting against racial injustice. But if she ruled against him, it could ignite even more public outrage. As she prepared for the trial, Laura felt a familiar unease creeping up her spine. The stakes were high, not just for Samuel, but for the city as a whole. Meanwhile, Michael was feeling the weight of his new role. He had become a familiar face in the community, and slowly, People were beginning to open up to him. But the pushback from his fellow officers had been growing louder. "Community outreach is a joke," Officer Tom Richards scoffed one afternoon at the precinct. Richards had been on the force for 15 years, and he wasn't shy about his disdain for the changes taking place. "You're wasting your time, Davis. These people don't want to work with us. They just want to make us the bad guys." Michael clenched his jaw, holding back his frustration. "That's not true, Richards. They want to be treated with respect, just like anyone else." Richards shook his head. "You're naive if you think this is going to change anything. We do our jobs, and they hate us for it." Michael took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had heard this argument before. The resistance from within the department was growing, and it wasn't just Richards. Other officers were grumbling about the new initiatives, and some had even started to actively undermine the efforts. Chief Walker had noticed the growing divide as well. He called Michael into his office one afternoon. "You're making progress out there," Walker said, leaning back in his chair. "But I need you to be aware that not everyone is happy about it." "I know," Michael replied, his voice steady. "I've heard the comments." Walker sighed. "It's not just comments. Some of the senior officers have been pushing back against the community outreach programs. They think it's a waste of time." Michael frowned. "What do we do?" Walker looked out the window, his expression thoughtful. "We keep pushing. Change doesn't come without resistance. You're doing good work, Davis. Don't let them get to you." Michael nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the resistance was more than just grumbling. Something was brewing, and he wasn't sure how much longer the department could hold together. The trial of Samuel Dawson began with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The courtroom was packed. Samuel's family, community activists, and members of the media filled the seats. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that this case was about more than just one young man's innocence. It was about the justice system itself and whether it could be trusted to deliver fair outcomes for everyone. Samuel sat at the defense table, his hands folded in his lap. His lawyer, Maya Roberts, was a sharp, determined woman who had made a name for herself defending clients in cases involving racial injustice. Laura had seen Maya in court before, and she respected her tenacity. She knew that Maya would fight hard for Samuel, but the evidence against him, while flimsy, was enough to make this a difficult case. The prosecution presented their case first, relying heavily on the testimony of the eyewitness, Frank Green, a store clerk who had identified Samuel as the suspect. But as Maya began her cross-examination, it became clear that Green's testimony was shaky at best. "Mr. Green," Maya said, her voice sharp and clear, "you testified that you saw the suspect's face clearly during the robbery, correct?" "Yes," Green replied, though his voice wavered slightly. "But isn't it true that the store's security footage shows you were at least 20 feet away from the suspect and that it was dark outside at the time?" Green shifted in his seat. "Well, yes, and isn't it also true," Maya continued, her words quick and decisive, "that the suspect was wearing a hoodie pulled up over his head, obscuring most of his face?" Green hesitated. "I suppose so." Maya smiled slightly. "So, Mr. Green, how can you be sure that it was Samuel Dawson you saw that night?" The courtroom was silent as Green struggled to find an answer. Laura watched carefully, her mind turned over the facts. The prosecution's case was falling apart piece by piece. As the trial wore on, the city's tension began to bubble over. The public had been following the case closely, and many saw it as a test of whether the justice system could be trusted to deliver a fair outcome for a young black man who had been wrongfully accused. The protests outside the courthouse grew larger with each passing day. Signs reading "Justice for Samuel" and "End Racial Profiling" filled the streets, and the chants of the protesters echoed through the city. Michael had been tasked with monitoring the protests, and he could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as Michael stood near the courthouse steps, he spotted Marcus in the crowd. The young man was holding a sign that read, "Innocent until proven black." Their eyes met, and Marcus gave him a nod. Michael nodded back, feeling a swell of pride. Marcus had come a long way since the day they had met at the protests, and Michael knew that the fight for justice had become personal for him as well. But as the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the city reached a breaking point. Rumors began to spread that the police were preparing to crack down on the protests, and Michael could sense the fear growing in the crowd. He knew that one wrong move could ignite the situation into chaos. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. Laura sat on her bench, her face calm and composed, though inside she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The jury had reached a verdict, and the entire city was waiting to hear it. Samuel Dawson sat beside his lawyer, his face pale but resolute. His mother sat behind him, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, and Laura could feel the tension radiating from every corner. The jury foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that would determine Samuel's fate. Laura took a deep breath and nodded for the verdict to be read. "We, the jury, find the defendant Samuel Dawson not guilty." The room erupted into a mix of cheers and gasps. Samuel's family burst into tears, hugging one another as the weight of the trial was lifted from their shoulders. In the gallery, the community activists who had been fighting for justice embraced, their faces filled with relief. But outside the courthouse, the reaction was more complicated. The crowd of protesters cheered for the verdict, but there was a sense of unfinished business in the air. Samuel had been found not guilty, but the system that had nearly condemned him remained intact. As Samuel's family left the courthouse, the crowd swelled around them, chanting, "Justice for Samuel." But the chant soon shifted to a broader demand: justice for all. Laura sat in her chambers after the trial, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. She had done her job, followed the law, and delivered a fair verdict. But the larger battle, the fight for real systemic change, was still raging. Her phone buzzed on her desk, and she glanced at the screen to see a text from Paul. "Proud of you, Laura. Let's talk tonight. Big things ahead." Laura smiled softly, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew that the verdict in Samuel's case was a victory, but it was only one battle in a much larger war. The city was still on edge, and the demands for justice were growing louder. She stood up and looked out the window at the protesters still gathered outside. The chants had changed, but the message was clear: this isn't over. Outside the courthouse, Michael stood among the protesters, feeling the energy of the crowd. The verdict had been a victory, but the fight wasn't over. He knew that now. The system that had nearly condemned Samuel Dawson was still the same system he worked within, and if real change was going to happen, it would take more than a single verdict. Marcus approached him, a smile on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "We did," Michael replied, "but there's still a lot more to do." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. This is just the beginning." Michael looked out at the crowd, feeling a strange sense of hope and responsibility. He had seen the system fail too many people, and now he was determined to be part of the solution. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was an advocate, a listener, someone who was willing to fight for real change. As the sun began to set over the city, Michael made a silent vow to himself. He would keep pushing, keep listening, and keep fighting for the justice that people like Samuel and Olivia deserved. The days following Samuel Dawson's acquittal were a mix of cautious optimism and lingering unrest. The verdict had been a victory, but the system that had nearly condemned him remained unchanged. The city was in a strange place. There was relief, but also a gnawing sense that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Judge Laura Grant sat in her office reviewing case files. Since the Samuel Dawson trial, she had been inundated with requests from civil rights groups, attorneys, and even the media. Everyone wanted to know her opinion on the state of the justice system and what could be done to fix it. But Laura knew that systemic reform wasn't something that could be solved with interviews or public statements. It was a marathon, not a sprint. She glanced at the framed photo of her grandmother on her desk. Evelyn Grant had fought her own battles in the 1960s, marching for civil rights, risking her life for a better future. Laura often wondered what her grandmother would think of today's struggles. Would she see progress, or would she recognize the same fights, repackaged for a new generation? Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Chief Daniel Walker. "Judge Grant," Walker said, his voice steady. "I wanted to thank you for the way you handled the Samuel Dawson trial. I know it wasn't easy." "Thank you, Chief," Laura replied, though there was an edge of exhaustion in her voice. "But we both know the work is far from over." Walker sighed on the other end of the line. "You're right. The department's under more pressure than ever. There are officers who want to see change and others who think we're losing control. It's a mess." "Change always is," Laura said softly, "but we can't afford to shy away from it." There was a pause before Walker spoke again. "I'm going to need your help, Judge. We've got a lot of work to do, and we can't do it without the courts on our side." "I'm here, Chief," Laura replied. "Whatever it takes." Meanwhile, Officer Michael Davis found himself walking a delicate line between two worlds. In the community, he had begun to earn trust, but within the department, the pushback was growing stronger. Officers like Tom Richards and other senior members of the force had become more vocal in their disdain for the changes that were being implemented. They saw the growing community outreach programs as a waste of time, and many believed the police were being unfairly blamed for problems they didn't create. Michael was caught in the middle. He wanted to stand up for the community he had begun to connect with, but he also knew that he couldn't alienate his fellow officers. He had to find a way to bring the two sides together or risk being torn apart himself. One afternoon, as Michael sat in the precinct's locker room, he overheard a group of officers talking nearby. "This whole community outreach thing is ridiculous," one of them said, his voice laced with frustration. "We're cops, not social workers." "Exactly," another officer chimed in. "These protests, these cases, they act like we're the enemy. We're out there risking our lives every day, and they don't even want to give us the benefit of the doubt." Michael stood up, his fists clenched. He had heard enough. He couldn't stay silent anymore. "You're wrong," he said, his voice cutting through the room. The officers turned to face him, surprised by his outburst. "We're not the enemy, but we're not blameless either. We've made mistakes, and it's our job to fix them." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You've been spending too much time with those protesters, Davis. You're losing sight of what it means to be a cop." "No," Michael said firmly. "I'm not. I know exactly what it means to be a cop. It means protecting people, all people. It means doing better when we know we've been wrong. And right now we've got a lot of work to do." Richards glared at him but didn't argue further. The room was tense, but Michael stood his ground. He knew that this fight wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. Too much was at stake. As the tension within the police department grew, Chief Walker called for a series of mandatory workshops, bringing together community leaders, activists, and police officers to discuss the issues that were driving a wedge between them. Michael was assigned to attend these workshops, and though he was nervous about how it would go, he knew it was a step in the right direction. The first workshop was held at a local community center, and as Michael walked in, he saw familiar faces. Community members he had met during the protests, including Marcus. The room was filled with a mix of police officers and residents, and the atmosphere was charged with a combination of mistrust and cautious hope. Cheryl Adams, the coordinator of the community center, stood at the front of the room, ready to facilitate the discussion. "We're here today to have an honest conversation," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We're not here to point fingers or assign blame. We're here to find solutions." Michael sat beside Officer Rebecca Carter, one of the few officers he knew who had fully embraced the need for change. As the workshop began, the community members spoke about their experiences with the police, stories of harassment, racial profiling, and fear. It was hard to listen to, but Michael knew that these stories needed to be heard. After a while, the conversation shifted to the officers in the room. Cheryl invited them to share their perspectives, to explain what it was like to walk the streets in uniform, facing danger every day. Richards, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke up. "Look, I get it. I know people are angry, but we're out there every day putting our lives on the line. It's not easy. And when people look at us like we're the enemy, it makes our job that much harder." There was a murmur in the room, and Michael could feel the tension rising again. He knew that what Richards was saying had truth to it, but it wasn't the whole story. Marcus stood up, his eyes locked on Richards. "You think it's hard for you? Try walking down the street in this neighborhood every day, knowing that you could be stopped by the police for no reason. Try growing up in a place where you're taught to fear the people who are supposed to protect you." The room went silent. Richards shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't respond. Michael saw his moment. He stood up, turning to face both the officers and the community members in the room. "We're all scared," he said, his voice steady. "The truth is, we've been taught to fear each other. And that fear is what's tearing us apart, but we can't keep doing this. We can't keep seeing each other as threats. We have to find a way to work together." Marcus looked at Michael, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So what do you suggest?" Michael took a deep breath. "We start by listening, really listening. We can't fix everything overnight, but we can start by building trust. And that means showing up, not just when there's a crime, but every day. It means treating everyone with respect, no matter what." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Cheryl smiled. "That's a good start, Officer Davis. But like you said, trust takes time." Michael nodded. "I know, but I'm willing to put in the time, and I hope the rest of us are too." While Michael worked to bridge the divide between the police and the community, Laura was making moves of her own. She had been quietly gathering support for a new initiative, a judicial review board that would oversee cases of racial profiling and police misconduct. It was a controversial idea, but Laura believed it was necessary if the justice system was going to be held accountable. She had spent weeks meeting with city officials, lawyers, and community activists, building a coalition of supporters who were willing to push for the creation of the review board. But she knew that there were powerful forces working against her, including members of the police union and conservative politicians who saw the board as overreach. One evening, Laura sat at her desk, reviewing the proposal for the board, when her phone buzzed with a message from Mayor Sarah Nichols. "We need to talk." Tomorrow at 9 a.m., Laura's heart raced as she read the message. She knew that the mayor had been on the fence about the review board, and this meeting could be the turning point. If she could convince the mayor to back the initiative, it could mean real, lasting change for the city. The next morning, Laura arrived at City Hall, her heart pounding with anticipation. Mayor Nichols greeted her in her office, her expression serious. "Judge Grant," the mayor began, "I've been reviewing your proposal for the Judicial Review Board. It's ambitious, and it's going to face a lot of opposition. I I know, Laura replied, her voice steady. But it's necessary. The mayor leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. You're asking me to support something that could put me at odds with some very powerful people. Are you sure this is the right move? Laura looked the mayor in the eye, her voice unwavering. This isn't about politics. This is about justice. The people of this city need to know that the system works for them, not against them. And right now, they don't believe that. Mayor Nichols was silent for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly. All right, Judge Grant, you've got my support, but this is going to be a fight. Laura smiled, relieved washing over her. I'm ready for it. As the months passed, both Michael and Laura continued their work, each fighting for change in their own way. Michael's efforts in the community were beginning to show results. People were starting to trust him, and he had built relationships with leaders like Marcus and Cheryl. It wasn't perfect, and there was still resistance within the department, but progress was being made. Meanwhile, Laura's Judicial Review Board proposal was gaining traction. With the mayor's support, she had been able to push the initiative through the city council, and the board was set to launch in the coming months. It was a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction. One evening, as the city settled into a quiet, reflective moment, Michael and Laura found themselves at the same community event. It was a forum, similar to the one they had attended months earlier, but this time there was a sense of hope in the air. Michael spotted Laura across the room and made his way over to her. She smiled when she saw him, and for a moment they stood in silence, taking in the energy of the room. You've done good work, Laura said softly. So have you, Michael replied. But there's still so much more to do. Laura nodded, her expression thoughtful. There always will be, but at least we're on the right path. Michael smiled. Yeah, we are. As the night went on, they both mingled with the community members, listening to their stories, sharing their hopes for the future. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, both Michael and Laura felt like they were making real progress, together. Months later, the city had begun to change. The Judicial Review Board was up and running, and cases of police misconduct were being thoroughly investigated for the first time in the city's history. The community outreach programs had expanded, and more officers were starting to embrace the idea that their job wasn't just to enforce the law, but to serve the people with fairness and respect. Michael had become a leader in the outreach efforts, and he had earned the respect of both the community and many of his fellow officers. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but Michael had found his purpose. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a bridge, helping to connect two sides that had long been at odds. Laura, too, had found her place in the fight for justice. The review board had been her brainchild, but she knew that it was only the beginning. There were still many battles to be fought, but for the first time she felt like the city was moving in the right direction. One afternoon, as Laura walked through the courthouse, she saw Michael standing at the top of the steps, talking with a group of young people. He looked up and saw her, and they exchanged a smile with a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through. Laura paused for a moment, watching the scene unfold. The city wasn't perfect. The system wasn't perfect, but it was changing, and that was something worth fighting for. As the sun set over the city, Laura felt a sense of peace settling over her. There was still work to be done, but they were on the path toward something better. 1 year had passed since the Samuel Dawson trial, and the city had undergone a transformation. The streets, once filled with protests and cries for justice, were now quieter, but the spirit of change remained alive. The Judicial Review Board, spearheaded by Judge Laura Grant, had become a beacon of accountability, ensuring that cases of police misconduct were thoroughly investigated and that justice was served fairly. Officer Michael Davis had become a key figure in the community. earning the trust of those who had once viewed the police as the enemy. His role in the Community Outreach Division had expanded, and he was now leading efforts to train new officers on how to build relationships with the people they served, focusing on de-escalation and empathy. But while progress had been made, both Michael and Laura knew that their work was far from over. The system, while improving, was still imperfect. There were still moments of tension, still instances where old biases resurfaced. But the difference now was that there were people, like Michael and Laura, who were willing to confront those challenges head-on. Laura stood in her chambers, reviewing a case file. The room was quiet, the air filled with the soft hum of her desk lamp. Her judicial robe hung neatly on a hook by the door, a symbol of the responsibility she had carried for so many years. She had presided over countless cases, some of them heartbreaking, others inspiring. But the work she was most proud of was the creation of the Judicial Review Board. The board had taken on cases that would have otherwise been swept under the rug, instances of racial profiling, wrongful arrests, and excessive force. It wasn't perfect, and there were still battles to be fought, but Laura knew that the board had already made a difference. It had given people hope, a belief that the system could be held accountable. As she packed up her things for the day, there was a knock at the door. She looked up to see Paul, her husband, standing in the doorway, his warm smile and familiarity. "Ready to head home?" Paul asked, leaning against the doorframe. Laura smiled, feeling a sense of peace settled over her. "I think so. It's been a long day." Paul walked over to her, gently taking her hand. "You've done good work, Laura. You've made a real difference." Laura nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "It's not just me. There are so many people out there fighting for the same thing. We're all part of something bigger." Paul squeezed her hand, his voice soft. "You've built something that will last. That's a legacy." Laura's eyes misted over for a moment, but she quickly blinked the tears away. She had always known that her work wasn't just about the cases in front of her. It was about creating a future where people like Samuel Dawson and Olivia Williams could trust the justice system. And now, with the review board in place, she felt like she had laid the foundation for that future. On the other side of the city, Michael Davis stood in front of a room full of new police recruits. The academy classroom was filled with fresh faces, young men and women who had signed up to serve and protect their communities. Michael could see eagerness in their eyes, the same eagerness he had once felt when he was in their shoes. But he also knew that the world they were stepping into was complicated, and the line between protector and oppressor was often blurred by fear and bias. Michael had been invited to speak to the recruits about his experiences, and as he looked out at the group, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. He didn't want them to make the same mistakes he had made. He wanted them to see the people they served as equals, not threats. "Good morning," Michael began, his voice steady and confident. "I'm Officer Michael Davis, and I've been with the department for a little over 8 years now. I'm here today to talk to you about something that doesn't get talked about enough: trust. Trust between the police and the community." The room was silent. The recruits listened intently. "When I first started, I thought being a cop was all about enforcing the law. But I've learned that it's about much more than that. It's about listening. It's about showing people that you see them, that you respect them, and that you're there to protect them, not just police them." Michael paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "The truth is, I've made mistakes. I've let fear and bias cloud my judgment. But I've learned from those mistakes, and I'm here to help you avoid making the same ones." One of the recruits raised his hand. "Officer Davis, how do you rebuild trust once it's been broken?" Michael smiled, grateful for the question. "You show up, you listen, and most importantly, You treat people with dignity, no matter what. Trust isn't something you can earn in a day. It takes time, patience, and consistency. But if you're committed to it, you can make a difference. The recruit nodded, clearly absorbing the message. Michael continued, his voice filled with conviction. This job isn't easy. You're going to face challenges that will test you, that will make you question why you're here. But remember this: every person you meet deserves to be treated with respect, no matter what. That's how you build trust. That's how you serve your community. Later that evening, Michael found himself back at the community center, the place where his journey toward redemption had truly begun. The center was hosting an event to celebrate the progress that had been made over the past year, and Michael had been invited to speak. As he walked through the doors, he was greeted by Cheryl Adams, who gave him a warm smile. "Officer Davis," she said, her tone filled with pride. "Look at you now. A year ago, I wasn't sure you'd make it." Michael chuckled. "Honestly, I wasn't sure either." Cheryl shook her head. "You've done good work, Michael. The community sees you now. They trust you." "That means everything to me," Michael replied, his voice sincere. "But I couldn't have done it without you and the people here." As the event began, Michael spotted Marcus across the room talking with a group of teenagers. The sight brought a smile to his face. Marcus had become a leader in his own right, using his experiences to mentor younger kids and keep them on the right path. Michael made his way over to Marcus, who greeted him with a nod. "You ready for your speech, Officer Davis?" Marcus asked, a teasing grin on his face. Michael laughed. "As ready as I'll ever be." The two of them stood together for a moment, watching the crowd. The community center was buzzing with energy, filled with people who had once been on opposite sides, but were now working together for a common cause. "I'm proud of you, Marcus," Michael said quietly. "You've come a long way." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "We all have." At the end of the night, Laura arrived at the community center. She had been invited to the event as well, and as she walked through the doors, she spotted Michael standing with Marcus. A sense of pride swelled in her chest. Over the past year, she had watched Michael grow from a man who had struggled with his own biases to someone who had become a true advocate for justice. And she had been part of that journey, whether he realized it or not. Michael saw Laura and waved her over. "Judge Grant," he greeted her with a smile. "Good to see you." "You too, Officer Davis," Laura replied warmly. "It looks like you've made quite the impact here." Michael shrugged, though there was pride in his eyes. "It's a team effort. We're all in this together." Laura nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's what it's all about, isn't it? Working together to build something better." As the night wound down, Laura and Michael stood side by side, watching as the community came together. The past year had been filled with challenges, but it had also brought growth, healing, and a renewed sense of purpose. They both knew that the work was far from over, but for the first time they felt like they were on solid ground, like the city was finally starting to move in the right direction. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that together they could continue to push for justice and equality that everyone deserved. As the event wrapped up, the attendees slowly filtered out of the community center. The evening air was cool, and the sky above was clear, filled with stars. Laura and Michael walked out together, the energy of the night still buzzing between them. For the first time in a long while, the city felt at peace. "Where do we go from here?" Michael asked, his voice filled with curiosity and hope. Laura smiled softly, looking up at the stars. "We keep pushing. We keep fighting. But more importantly, we keep listening." Michael nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "You're right. We've come so far, but there's still more to do." As they stood together watching the city they had both worked so hard to change, They knew that the journey toward justice was far from over, but they were ready for it. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and setbacks, but it would also be filled with moments of growth, healing, and connection. Together, they would continue to build a city where justice wasn't just a word, it was a reality. And with that, they turned and walked into the night, their hearts filled with hope for the future. If you found this story of growth, redemption, and justice inspiring, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter. Subscribe now to join the journey of change and stay connected with stories that touch the heart and challenge the mind.